silence was only broken by the sound of raindrops. Sarah, a 23-year-old girl who always seemed to have a vague dream and a distant look, lived in one of the upper rooms of the dormitory. She often told her friends about the strange occurrences in her room, shadows that slid in corners and whispers that came from the walls. But none of her friends took her words seriously. One night, like other nights, everyone was asleep when suddenly a loud and terrified scream came from another room. All the girls woke up in fear and concern. Sarah hurried towards the source of the sound and saw one of her friends, Layla, sitting on the bed with a pale face and eyes widened with fear. "What happened? Why did you scream?" Sarah asked worriedly. Layla replied with a trembling voice. "When I was about to sleep, I saw a creature with a very scary face right in front of me. It seemed to come out of the wall and..." Layla couldn't finish her sentence. The other girls had gathered in the room and looked at her with eyes full of doubt and fear. Sarah looked at the wall where Layla had pointed, but saw nothing. She glanced at her friends and said, "Maybe it was just a nightmare." But in her heart, she knew that the events she had experienced were beyond simple nightmares. And now, it seemed that these occurrences had begun to spread. In the following days, more strange and mysterious events occurred. Inanimate objects moved suddenly, incomprehensible sounds were heard from the air, and ownerless shadows roamed the rooms. Sarah and her friends tried to uncover the mystery of these phenomena, but with every step they took, they became more lost in the darkness and the unknown. And at night, when all the lights were off and absolute silence ruled the dormitory, Sarah knew they were not alone, and this was only the beginning of the story. Sarah said seriously to her friends, "To discover the source of these strange occurrences, we must spend a lot of time in the place where most of these events happened. We should even wait there at night instead of sleeping, in hopes that something might happen that will help us understand the reason behind these events." Her friends looked at each other with hesitation, but eventually, they all agreed. They decided to gather in Sarah's room at night, where most of the strange events had occurred. The first night, they all armed themselves with flashlights and notebooks. Hours passed, and nothing happened except for the sound of the wind and rain. But exactly at midnight, a soft, whispering voice came from a corner of the room. Everyone held their breath. The voice grew closer and closer, yet nothing was visible. Who are you?" Sarah asked with a trembling voice. But there was no answer. Suddenly, one of the notebooks fell from the table and its pages began to flip rapidly. The girls clung to each other in terror, and Sarah ordered the lights to be turned on. When the light filled the room, nothing unusual could be seen. But when they looked at the notebook, they realized that something was written on one of the pages in an incomprehensible and frightening script. "Closer than you think." Days turned into nights, and each night, stranger and more terrifying events occurred. Shadows moved without a light source, sounds came from the walls, and even images appeared in the mirrors for a moment before disappearing. Sarah and her friends became more and more convinced each night that their dormitory was hosting entities that existed beyond the material world. And one night, when everyone was gathered in Sarah's room waiting for another event, suddenly one of the walls began to crack. The cracks deepened, and a sound like the moaning of the wind came from them. The girls looked at the wall in fear, and saw that from the cracks, an unnatural light was leaking. A light that seemed to come from another world. After several weeks of waiting in Sarah's room, she suggested to her friends, "Let's spend tonight in my room with a few candles." Sarah continued, "Because I've heard that candles are often used to summon supernatural beings or attract them to this world." Her friends, with a mix of curiosity and fear, accepted her suggestion and spent that night with a few candles in the room. Hours passed without incident until the clock struck 3 in the morning. Then, incomprehensible whispers could be heard, growing louder and more distinct. Sarah and her friends were terrified. They stared at a corner of the room from which the whispers seemed to emanate, and suddenly, a very scary and horrifying creature appeared. One of Sarah's friends fainted at the sight of this terrifying scene. Their hands were trembling with fear, trying to revive their unconscious friend. Sarah, with a voice trying to be firm and composed, said, "We must remain calm. We do not know what this entity is or what it wants, but we must be strong and..." If you enjoyed it so far, please hit the subscribe button if you liked the video. But before she could finish her sentence, a growling sound erupted from the creature, shaking the entire room. One by one, the candles went out, and complete darkness took over. In that darkness, only the sound of the girl's rapid, frightened breaths could be heard. With a heart pounding in her chest, Sarah faced the creature and asked with a voice she tried to keep steady, "What are you, and what do you want from us?" The creature, with a terrifying gaze that seemed to penetrate the depths of one's soul, answered, "I'm one of the demons who escaped from hell, and for years I have taken this place as my own, living here. You are disturbing my peace, and I would like to retaliate for this annoyance by taking your lives." Having finished speaking, the creature let out a thunderous cry and vanished. The girls, now shaking violently, were engulfed in silence and fear. Sarah, still unable to believe what she had heard, looked at her friends and said, "We must do something. We cannot let this creature rule over us." They decided to seek help and find a way to confront this demon. But it was not going to be easy. The girls' dormitory, once a place of safety and calm, had now become a battleground against dark forces. And with every sound that came from the walls, with every shadow that slipped around a corner, more fear and terror took root in their hearts. Amidst all this, Sarah, who had now risen to lead the group, knew they had to find a way to save her friends and reclaim the dormitory from the clutches of this demonic being. An idea struck Sarah. She went to the dormitory supervisor and recounted all the events, seeking help. The supervisor, surprised and frightened by Sarah's story, told her, "Wait a few minutes. I know a group of paranormal investigators. I'll call them and inform them about this situation." The supervisor made the call, narrated the events, and the paranormal investigators told the supervisor they would come to the dormitory that night. The supervisor agreed and hung up the phone. Night fell, and the paranormal investigators arrived at the dormitory. They waited until 3 a.m. and then began the rituals to summon and banish demonic entities or spirits. The rituals concluded after 3 hours. Sarah and her friends, along with the dormitory supervisor, were overjoyed and expressed their gratitude to the team of paranormal investigators. Finally, the girls' dormitory was once again a place of peace and security. The terrifying tales of the past nights were now just memories lingering in the corners of Sarah and her friends' minds. They returned to their normal lives, but they never forgot that sometimes there is a world beyond what their eyes can see.